employ the rule of thirds and the Fibonacci spiral and what's known as the phi grid, the PHI grid, which is just kind of like a little bit scrunched in rule of thirds. You'll find that as you practice more and more with these basic tenets of the rule of thirds, you're going to be able to find that balance without even thinking in this sort of grid system. So even though it's a big photo and it creates a huge, big impression right off the bat, it's easy to kind of throw composition out the window because you're in the moment and you just know that this polar bear is perfectly lit up from side light, it's soft light, it's low angled light, like everything's fantastic. But just I always start with very traditional compositional rules, even when I'm photographing these big things in big sort of big impression kind of ways. And one trick that I often employ when I think of, what makes a quote unquote big photo for me, and sometimes this happens in the editing process when I'm culling my photos. Sometimes it happens when I'm choosing which polar bear to photograph in the field or which deer I'm photographing in the field, is I'm looking at the scene, maybe looking through my viewfinder. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll actually kind of look off screen. I'll look at this image with my peripheral vision and I'll see, can I identify what's happening in this scene? Can I identify this animal? Do I know it's a bear? Can I tell it's looking at me? Are there simple yet effective colors? Because my peripheral vision kind of strains out all the noise. And I find it's a really interesting technique. I probably employ it, frankly, more when I'm editing photos, when I'm trying to figure out like which one's going to look better. Because a lot of my photography will be on, small thumbnails on websites or on half pages of magazines. They're not usually at this point in travel photography and wildlife photography, they're not going on big billboards per se. These are things that are happening on websites and social media and the like. And so we have to almost kind of think smaller than we might be experiencing in the moment. I know that's almost counterintuitive to what oftentimes we feel when they're out there and with wildlife. Like we feel we're part of this huge big scene and we want to envelop it all. But sometimes kind of using that peripheral vision technique and thinking small works quite well. And then the same buddy I was just mentioned before gave me this really interesting eye-opening technique for editing. And I'm not going to go into editing a lot in this presentation, but he says when he edits his photos, he always zooms out in Lightroom or Camera Raw, meaning it's not a full screen. Like he only edits on his laptop and he makes it even smaller because he wants to see the whole big picture as one unified thing. He doesn't want to have to dart his eyes around the screen, left, right, top to bottom. So when he's editing and making, whether it's global edits or localized edits, he's actually looking at a small version of that photo. And I think it's just an interesting way to kind of start this conversation of wildlife photography because it's oftentimes the opposite of what we think. So I oftentimes start with the rules, but I break the rules quite often. And one of the things I have really trained myself to do over the years is try to avoid that temptation of just going for the big shot, the big photo right away. Sometimes it's easy to do. Sometimes it just presents itself opportunistically. Wildlife photography is very opportunistic. But I've found that sometimes I will force myself to only shoot with a 24 to 105 for a whole day, or I'll put the 70 to 200 on and only photograph with that, or just I'll force myself to not zoom in all the way to 500 millimeters because it looks good in the back of the camera. Of course, that's our instant gratification. It's very tempting just to judge your own photo accomplishment or the checkbox, be like, okay, I got that, I nailed it. Now let's move on to the thing over to our left because there's a lot going on in this scene on the Serengeti. But oftentimes, my favorite wildlife photography is what I would term, wildlife in landscape shots. And I think it's a huge differentiator when you are getting out there in the wild because it showcases the environment. Oftentimes, the landscape is very beautiful. It's incredible textures, patterns, colors, and it really adds to the scene. A shot like this would never really be a good shot as a landscape shot. There's not really enough to it. But as soon as you pull the wildlife in, or a shot like this, all of a sudden it just really, really brings everything together. The wildlife is small. It's not your classic kind of quote unquote guidebook shot where it's full frame. You can count the whiskers on its nose and you can see the different colors of its eyeball. But I think that forcing yourself to zoom out and really kind of skew the perspective is a very important skill to integrate in your photography. Not the only thing. The big photos are great. They work for me a lot. I sell a lot of those photos and use a lot of those photos. They're great for presentations and connecting people to animals from a conservation photography standpoint. But oftentimes there's those environmental photos that work really, really well. One of the things that I do often when I'm faced with scenes like this here, where the National Elk Refuge just outside of Jackson, Wyoming, is I'll break the rule of thirds. I will deliberately place the animal when I'm in front of a big, amazing scene with a pretty big, amazing animal, and I'll kind of deliberately make that animal look small. This works particularly well when you have a big scene in the background. I'll put it at the very lower tenth, lower fifth of the scene. Same thing with this shot. I'm going to deliberately break the rules, and as you all probably know, the last place we want to put a subject in the photo is in the dead middle of the frame, right? That's usually not going to make an aesthetic shot. It's usually not going to be balanced. But oftentimes, when we think of wildlife photography and we're in front of big animals, throwing the viewer, throwing your audience for a little bit of a loop, kind of creating that tension by the viewer and saying, "Oh my gosh, this is a huge, 20,000, 30,000 pound elephant, and it's so small in the frame. This area of Namibia must be vast." And it starts to get the viewer to think, where were you? Where was it? What's the context of all this? And so I do like to adhere to the rules right off the bat, and then I break them pretty quickly based on the circumstances. Angles are extraordinarily important for wildlife photography. Um, shooting at eye level is just oh so important, and I probably don't need to tell you the merits of it, but I'll tell you anyway. The idea is that you're getting a lot more distance, you're getting background separation, you're getting the environment, and this is a decent eye level shot. Sometimes on wildlife safari, it can be quite difficult. Like when we're in and around and in front of big predators, it's one of the hardest times to be at eye level with wildlife because oftentimes we're not allowed out of vehicles. It's not safe. But if you go the extra mile, instead of putting your camera up at eye level, it might be just rotating that back screen and putting it 2 feet down or a foot and a half down on the railing. It might be just hanging the camera out of the side. I'll shoot wider just because I know I'm not going to lock perfect composition, but getting at eye level uh, really provides that beautiful background separation, that distance versus just having the grass directly in the background. And this is kind of like a mid-level shot on that end, but notice how much better background you get, how much more environmental type portrait you get when I just go from something that's maybe at chest level down to maybe below the handle of the vehicle that I'm actually in. I think it's a really, really important thing. And it's not just for the big stuff as well. So I think it's one of those, this is something where I can't imagine a time, or many times, there are always exceptions to the rules, but I can't imagine a time where I would have preferred a top-down shot of wildlife, or I would have preferred a shot of wildlife not somewhere near in and around head and eye level. And it just goes to show you that it's so important to kind of adhere to some of these things and really remind yourself in the flurry, these grand moments, because mark my word, we're in a flurry when we're seeing, lions at dawn and, polar bears right outside the window of our Tundra Lodge, that sort of stuff. It is incredible, but it's backyard stuff too. Now, this is not my backyard. This is this is in Borneo, but the little things benefit equally because so much of wildlife photography is that background separation. So just getting down, I know photographers that will bring knee pads with them when they're doing macro work or when they're just doing any sort of work, because getting down a little bit lower, we're talking about a foot, 2 feet, makes a world of difference for photographing wildlife, big and small. So just to show you an example of what a shot would be, that is, obviously a glorious moment, like seeing a lion cub. This thing was like 20 feet away from the vehicle. It was gorgeous. It was at dusk. But I'm shooting kind of top down. Like I'm in the vehicle. I'm probably 3 or 4 feet above the terrain. And the difference here is that the background, instead of the distance of the fields of the Serengeti or the distant horizon, it's just those grasses. And you can have the shallowest depth of field possible. You can be shooting at f4, f2.8, but it's still not going to really separate this subject from the background, whereas just repositioning yourself a little bit does a world of difference. Still a good shot, still something that I think is quite compelling, especially if you crop it in and all that, but it does make quite a difference. So while other photographers may really dislike photographing wildlife in trees because oftentimes it leads to backlit conditions, I find that if there's a leopard on the ground next to me over here, and there's a leopard in the tree that's just a foot or two above me, I'm always going to be shooting up into the tree because I have that more eye level perspective versus photographing something that might be 4 or 5 feet below me. The angle is huge. So angle with wildlife is just a really, really important thing. I'll fix the shadows, I'll fix the backlight, I'll underexpose and expose for the highlights, that sort of stuff. But try and get shots at eye level is a really big key part of my mission. And I love any sort of trip that involves boats for that very reason. So if you're ever looking at a trip or planning a safari or whatever, if you can get in boats to take wildlife photos, it instantly puts you on plane with the wildlife. So you don't have to go through these extra steps. One of the techniques I was using on my last trip, I was just in Kenya and Tanzania a month ago. I rigged my tripod where I had the tripod plate on my lens foot, and I actually had the tripod. I was dangling it over the car, getting it on ground level. That was hard. I was holding, like a 10-pound camera and lens and tripod over the car just to get a little bit lower. But that's just the reality of things. So again, safaris, wildlife photography from boats, like here we are in the Kinabatangan River in Borneo, is just spectacular because you're already at that lower level, or you're kind of like a little bit below eye level. And not that we all have complete freedom to tell wildlife what to do and to perfectly position ourselves around wildlife no matter what. Photographing a little bit below eye level can be extraordinarily interesting. While just above eye level could maybe, I don't want to say botch the shot, but it might be something where it's significantly less aesthetic than at eye. Sometimes shooting just a little bit lower and up into the head, into the eyes and the wildlife gives this larger than life sort of grandeur appeal. So again, angle is vastly important to think about with wildlife photography. And I think I'll mention this again at some point in the presentation, but in case I don't, I want to also touch on, I don't have a slide for this, but this is really important about choosing your background. And again, it's tough to do with wildlife. It's easier to do with little things like butterflies and birds that are sitting on branches. Like particularly when we're on foot. I want you to think about this next time you're doing wildlife photography, is when you are in front of a wildlife subject, there's obviously some sort of background, right? And it might be green, it might be blue, it might be a brown tree trunk. It might be little patches of the sky. There's been so much benefit and so much improvement over the years in my photography as I learned to take small steps left or right, front or center, and take my focus, kind of pun intended, but like take my attention a little off of the wildlife subject. I might be waiting for it to open its eyes or look up to the sunlight to get that nice little glint of sunshine in its eyes. I am doing that all the time, but I might take my focus off and stop looking at that behavior in favor of what the background looks like. Is it mottled green bushes? Is it white sky? Is it a black rock in the background? Because it can make wildly different shots if you go 5 feet to your left or 5 feet to your right, or if you even put your camera overhead and use the swiveling screen, or just dip your camera down a little bit. Choosing your background is not easy with wildlife photography, but it is really, really important. And I can find not only do you ultimately get a better shot that you like more, but you might get 4 or 5 different shots of a similar scene that all make it into your final album and portfolio and website, et cetera, et cetera. So thinking about your background, especially with wildlife photography and the portraiture, because we're often trying to get that blur, that background separation, think about what those minute textures and colors and differences in lighting might end up being like if you can pivot around and angle yourself differently. Okay, so depth of field is another really, really big deal with wildlife photography. So I've talked about, the shallow depth of field and the background separation, and that's of course really important. But one of the things that it's surprising when you're put in front of big wildlife, especially up close. is how you actually might have to boost your depth of field in certain scenarios. So I think most folks will see classic wildlife portraiture and those there's really creamy bouquets or bokeh, tomato, that blurred background, the quality of the background, and say like that's definitely what I want. And of course, we have a nicely blurred background here, great background separation. But because I'm filling the frame, I was so close to this giraffe, like I was, feet away. And I was just snapping and snapping and snapping. I realized the composition, like I'm cutting off a little bit of the nose, but I'm sort of emphasizing the wrinkles in the eyes and the little flies around its eye. But I wanted to use this photo to show that, this is a photo that I had to shoot at like f8 or maybe even bigger, like f11, because when you have your wildlife subject taking up a majority of your scene, you almost have to treat that subject as if you're in front of a big mountain scene with the mountains in the distance and the wildflower meadow in the midground, and then the rocks or the tree in the foreground. When you want all of that in focus, you have to use a big depth of field, right? A big F number. So it's kind of the same thing with wildlife photography when you're filling the frame with that animal. If you shoot at a really shallow depth of field, which will guarantee you an even blurrier background and more background separation, you might start to notice that the eye is in focus. Again, you always have to focus on the eye. That's paramount. But with a scene like this where its wrinkles are really part of the scene, it's part of the allure of this photo. What if those wrinkles and the hair around the wrinkles, and what if the hair around the ear, what if those were not in focus? It wouldn't be the same shot. So sometimes when we are, again, filling the frame with big wildlife for these big impression photos, we actually do need to shoot at a little bit deeper depth of field. And again, f8 is something that I commonly use, even though I it's hard to have your cake and eat it too, right? You want the background separation, but you do want the whole animal in focus, like these classic scenes here. So okay, so let's kind of dive a little bit deeper into foreground and background separation. So this is a real common thing that we encounter with wildlife photography. A great wildlife sighting is, a young tiger cub, but it's deep in the brush, and you can see that I'm doing my best to try to create some blur in the foreground because of all those brushes. You can see it's almost like a halo around this tiger here. This is when the foreground is in the way. The background, this is a sloth bear in India as well. The background can kind of have the same thing. It's busy. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of textures, and it's distracting from the wildlife. And so there's a really important thing that involves the ratio of you to the foreground or background to the animal subject. So if we're thinking about that first tiger photo, and we really want to blur that foreground element. So we want to blur the brush and the branches, obviously getting the animal intact, sharp focus. It's always going to be significantly harder to do that if the ratio of you to the foreground is greater than the foreground is to the animal. So like this ratio here, right? Now mix that with this ratio. If you are very close to your foreground element and the animal is proportionally further away, you don't have to have a shallow depth of field. You don't need to be shooting at f4, f2.8. It is always going to be blurred, even at those big f numbers. So it's another thing to really keep in mind as you're setting up your shot. Maybe you are walking around on a hiking trail. Maybe you are in a Jeep. Maybe you're on safari. Moving a little bit to try to maximize that blur, because we can only do so much with our technical equipment. Whether we have a lens that can get to those shallow depths of field or not. If you start to think about it in this ratio of three parts, kind of like an A, B to C, if you can maximize that distance between the subject, the wildlife, and whatever you're trying to get blurred, it's going to make it exaggeratedly blurred that much more so. So same thing with background here. So if you are much closer to your wildlife subject, maybe a little bit of a dangerous situation here, not to scale, but if you are closer to your wildlife subject than it is the background, it is going to have a really nice blur. So much like when I was talking about with getting low for that lion shot, where you could see the horizon, you see that distance, I'm not shooting on a spectacular F number. I was probably at f5.6. My 100 to 500 tops out at f7.1. Like that's not a great aperture, but because the distance was so great, it still had that beautiful background separation and blur. Now, conversely, if you're dealing with a situation like this, if your animal subject is closer to the background, just like I mentioned in the foreground, you can have the fanciest lens in the world, and it's still not going to really provide that background separation and that portraiture look, that blur. So when possible, moving yourself around, moving the vehicle around, getting yourself in a position in a situation where you can maximize that background is always going to be really hugely advantageous to you. Okay. So another thing that I like to do, which is a little bit atypical, but I actually love to integrate the human element into my wildlife photography. So this might be because, I am also a travel photographer and I photograph for conservation magazines and travel catalogs and all that sort of stuff. So you have to show the activities. But I've found throughout my years that in the storytelling element of what I'm trying to do with my photography, whether it's showing to friends, whether it's writing, essays, whether it's posting on blogs or you name it. I find that actually integrating human-made vehicles or structures or people is often a really, really powerful thing for photography. And I just wanted to mention this because it's something that a lot of people that are kind of tried and true photographers don't immediately think of. They don't immediately think, hey, we're in front of this incredible scene. There are two bears. They're kind of playing and sparring a little bit. I'm going to leave this and I'm going to go to photograph the backs of the people photographing it. It's hard to train yourself to do it, but I can tell you, I have a lot of photos of bears from around the world from, years and years. And still to this day, this takes me back to the place. It's a core memory for myself. This photo probably gets picked up from more travel magazines than anything, that I've photographed in the area. And so kind of having the discipline and awareness to say, you know what, like sometimes you want to zoom out, sometimes you want to back up, like really kind of think about, how can I do something different here? How can I integrate people? And there are a lot of ways to do it. You can hand the camera off to a travel companion and you could get all the settings and you say, push this button and go for it. Like this little self-portrait here, just did that, just handed the camera to a colleague. And again, it's the stuff that really gets used and picked up a lot. And also, I happen to like it a lot myself. So integrating the human element, not obvious, but a really, really powerful thing to do. Maybe not every single shot. Maybe it's not your whole trip album isn't just the backs of people's heads, but I think it is a really powerful way to put your viewer in your place at that moment. It's a great picture yourself here kind of shot. And I've just noticed, whether it's over social media or showing photos to friends and family, like oftentimes, the big full frame face shot of the polar bear, like they'll be like, oh, okay. But then, having two people in the foreground looking at it or photographing other photographers is even better. Sometimes they resonate with that even more. So it's really quite interesting. So I love doing black and white photography with wildlife as well. This is not anything that I do in the moment, of course. I think you guys are all, pretty adept at how to do this with Lightroom and Camera Raw and all those sort of programs. But I do have to say it's a wonderful differentiator. I'm actually seeing it a little bit more and more these days in photo forums and with professional photographers, photo books. I think I think we're getting into a realm where it's very easy to over edit and oversaturate and maybe they're not even over edited and oversaturated. Maybe they're very real. Maybe the camera is just getting so good with the crispness and the clarity and the definition, but there's something kind of about a callback to kind of whether it's yesteryear or just simplicity or realism. It's a beautiful beautiful way to go, and so oftentimes this is something that I'll do when photographing. I'll just kind of make a mental note, or I'll have little like notebooks or something, or I'll even it's kind of weird to say, but I'll take a photo, like I'll take a photo like this, and then I'll take a photo of my hand in the safari vehicle, like an intentional, like this isn't going to turn out. And when I'm editing my photos and I see that hand, I'll say, oh. The photo right before that is the one I wanted to turn black and white. So little tricks like that and I do it for anything, but it tends to be a really good thing to do when you're kind of stuck with midday harsh shadows. With
Mhm.
wildlife photography, no doubt the best times of day are going to be your classic golden hour at either end of the day, your dawn and your dusk. When you go to a lot of wildlife destinations around the world, they're close to the equator, like Africa, Borneo, tropical rainforests, India. and that sun rises and sets very, very fast. So even though you might be out there before dawn and in position on, on like a photo trip, like the kind that I guide, you're going to get harsh shadows pretty quickly. And so I love doing this when I'm forced to have a lot of contrast and have to have a lot of highlights and bright spots and really, really dark darks and light lights. And it is, if you've ever edited black and white, it is a heck of a lot of fun. It's amazing because you can really push these meta sliders like the clarity and the dehaze. You can really push the blacks and mess around. You can darken the shadows and just create a lot of drama. And even though you're editing the heck out of it, um, it still looks very genuine and it doesn't look like you're trying to do anything real avant-garde. But I think it's really tapped into a different part of the artist in me when I can really make big Bob Ross brushstrokes across my photo and do really wild stuff and have it turn out to be a very usable photo in various forms. I don't talk about a lot of landscape photography in this presentation, but it's great for landscape photography too. Snowy scenes, reflection scenes, just give it a try. You might have to completely do something different with the sky versus the foreground, but it's easier than ever to do that. And again, big edits in Photoshop, Lightroom, Camera Raw that rescue the photo, that bring it to the vision you're trying to portray, do not look as over edited as you would with a color photograph. There's some beautiful simplicity about it. It's great for so many things when you have a lot of simple color palettes, when you have a lot of modeled coloration. It's fantastic for wildlife portraits as well. I think you can really boost the shadows. This photo, honestly, like if you really look at it, it's kind of blurry. Like it's still one of my favorite photos of this female orangutan in Borneo. But if you get into like the granular details, like the eyes aren't super sharp, not a lot of the hair is really sharp. I did not learn my lesson about getting that deep depth of field. I think we were, in the middle of the rainforest and I was shooting at ISO 6400 already, so I had to underexpose a shot and blah blah blah, a very slow shutter speed. But the the rawness and the kind of mystique, I think gets the average person to sort of sidestep all the rest of the issues that I just identified. There's something really ominous. There's something really tranquil and soulful and beautiful. You get that nice little catch light in the eye. It's even further exaggerated because you're dealing with just black and white. You're just dealing with values there. And so, yeah, I just encourage you to give it a try. And you don't have to really think about it in the field. It helps if you think about it and note it. It might be a midday shot. You might be really over or underexposing in the field. That's something that I like to do a lot when animals are, under a shade tree, but everything else is really bright. I might expose for the animals and blow the heck out of the highlights, like overblown, completely blown out. Great for black and white photography. It's excusable. Um, this is another kind of bit of advice on how to think about some wildlife photography is that we have an ability now with the way we present our photos that I would say is relatively unlike anything in the past where, we're not really printing off one photo for a gallery or sharing one photo at a time. Or at very least, if we are, we have an equal ability with social media, with websites, with all the different forms that we have, with photo books, et cetera, with blogs to photograph multiple things of the same scene. And so something I really like to do with wildlife is to start photographing in parts. And I think this Galapagos Islands tortoise is a great example. They're an amazing animal, but I have to say, um, when you are there seeing them and photographing them and trying to get their whole entity and their grandeur all in one shot, it's actually kind of tough. Like they don't look real crazy impressive when you just get this kind of half-dome tortoiseshell sitting in the grass. But as soon as you start breaking it down into parts, and thinking like, okay, so I'm gonna get a photo of really of just its eyes and its beak and it's kind of its nose, like big full frame shot. I'm gonna get a photo of this real rough, grizzled, foot pad and really, really zoom in and get that big depth of field. Again, a great example of when you really need to push like f8 and above because you want to show. It's almost like a macro photo. You want to showcase that texture. Um, I often will photograph just really, really close up stuff, like just zooming in on nothing but the elephant's eye. I might be in front of a chameleon in Madagascar, and it's a beautiful creature on its own, but this pattern on its skin is incredible. And so I'm sidestepping all the other photos, but you can imagine what they would be. You've got a full chameleon, you've got the chameleon in the environment, you've got the chameleon with the tail, you've got a chameleon action shot of its tongue going out. But kind of thinking about what are the nuanced parts that you may not see a lot of out there in wildlife photography, the textures, the patterns, the colors, really the zoomed in, almost borderline macro work. And that leads me to a little section on macro. So I love macro photography. I do have a dedicated macro lens and macro setup, but I'll be honest, I don't bring it around with me very much anymore. It's great fun. If you're ever, topped out of your camera lenses and don't know what to get next, or just want to rent something for the next week and have some fun with a macro setup is great fun. But again, a lot of times, especially with travel photography, we're very limited on weight and size and the amount of gear we can bring. And I already have a 45-pound gear bag with everything else photographically. So I've really adapted to taking macro photos without a macro lens over the years. And I just wanted to give you kind of a fun, simple technique for this. I'm just going to go through these. I'm going to get them all up on screen. Okay, so here's what you do. So you can do this with any lens. I typically do it with my 24 to 105. You can do it with a 24 to 70. There's different pros and cons of using like a 70 to 300 or a 70 to 200 or 100 to 500, because you're really trying to maximize the minimum focusing distance with the telephoto power. So we could get into some real nitty-gritty calculations based on every lens's minimum focusing distance and the magnification power. But really, I found the 24 to 105 is great. Okay, so the first thing is full manual across the board. So manual focus and manual settings. If you have a flash, it's great. Not required whatsoever. But a lot of us will have cameras that do not have shoe mounted, or not shoe mounted, but pop-up flashes. You don't need to have a flash, but if you have like a Canon Rebel or a Nikon 7200, something like that, it's got a pop up, it can be great fun. You got to worry a little bit about if the lens barrel gets in the way of the flash. But don't worry about that too much right now. You can just stick without flash because that can create some dramatic lighting. But the basic gist is you want to really maximize depth of field. So you're something between f8 and f16. Um, if if you have flash, you're gonna be limited to shutter speed, but I think something between 1/100 and 1/200 is pretty good, because again, you're really limiting light a lot by getting that big depth of field. And ISO, I tend to go with auto for starters, just to see what it gives me. When we're photographing in dim conditions or photographing insects at night, even, sometimes, like this is a moth that was just outside my room in a lodge in Papua New Guinea. I'll start with auto just to see what it gives me, but I will forcibly dial it down to the lowest setting possible just to add that better definition. But the real trick is it's not really those settings. Like those are actually pretty classic macro settings. The real trick is you want to, because you've set your focusing on manual, you're going to dial down to the minimum focusing distance. So, if it's Canon, you go clockwise, Nikon counterclockwise. I don't know, something, but you'll know which side it is. It's the opposite of the little infinity logo. And then you want to zoom all the way out. Okay. And then you become the focusing mechanism. Okay. So what you do is you look through your viewfinder or the back of the screen, and you approach that subject until the subject becomes in focus. And what that does is it maximizes the size of that critter in your sensor. Now, I'll say that again because that's the important part. It maximizes. It gives you're programming every little part of your camera to get the biggest size of that critter in your sensor. That's the best you can do. Now, it's not true one-to-one macro. Like a macro lens works a little bit different. So it doesn't perfectly replace a macro lens, but you'd be surprised what you can do with it with an 18 to 55, with again a 24 to 70, 24 105. You need some telephoto, so like it wouldn't work well with a 16 to 35 or a 10 to 22. Although those can produce really cool shots because you get more of the environment, but it's really kind of in that 70 to 100 range. It can produce some really, really nice effects. And again, that big depth of field gives you that texture and all the goodies right there. So I told you I might mention the choosing your background elsewhere in the presentation. So I do have it here. I wanted to mention it earlier because of the importance with big wildlife stuff, but it's also very important for macro work. So very common butterfly we might have in our backyards, if not this one, something else. And you can use this very same macro technique with butterflies. They're sometimes a little bit more flighty, obviously, but with some patience, you can definitely get these as well. But notice how when I do have a nice sedentary subject and I'm able to move around, this was my second shot of the sequence, but this was my first. And notice that subtle difference, but I think it's a big difference. Like that first shot, that light is just sort of encircling the butterfly, and it's almost like some nice spotlighting from behind, which is sort of weird. It's definitely not like a lighting on the subject, but it really makes it a much better photo in my mind. And that was, if you really compare the two side to side, it was I moved like I don't think I even moved. I think I just moved my camera a little bit to the left. So thinking about the background for macro photography is equally important. Okay. Animal behaviors. This is sort of the holy grail of wildlife photography is we're capturing behaviors. And my simple tip here is shoot on burst mode. This might be very self-evident, but I think that especially in the age of really, really big megapixel cameras, we're always a little bit hesitant to go for that 15 frames a second, 30 frames a second. It's like, oh my God, I'm gonna have to go through so many photos. I mean, I took 40,000 photos in this last Kenya trip, and it took me forever to go through them. However, and this isn't from Kenya, this is a Bornean sun bear in Borneo. However, I'm so glad I had that ultra burst mode on because it got me some of the shots of the trip. Because oftentimes what happens is when wildlife are moving, I talk about behavior, it doesn't have to be the big, crazy, awesome behavior to get you a much better photo by concentrating on behavior. So again, that burst mode, just as the animal is picking its head up, you can probably get 10, 15 photos just in that single sequence. And I promise you there's gonna be one where it's better than the rest. The catch light is just perfect in the eye. The teeth are kind of showing, but doesn't look like a grimace. It's this beautiful sun on the sun bear's chest. It's going to be a little bit more open and exposed as the shoulders rotate. And so, I just have to say the burst mode is something that it's you just have to do it. You have to go as high as you possibly can. Get the better memory card. Cull through the photos. There's AI now that'll cull through them for you. It's making such a difference for my photography. Again, not just for the high action. Like I think we would all obviously put our photo or our cameras in burst mode if we're photographing breaching humpback whales, right? Like we're gonna do that. We know that. But it's even the small slight movements that make it's just made a huge, huge difference. And of course, classic example of, lion cubs are frolicking in a little grassy patch, like definitely gonna go burst mode there. But again, it's even the sedentary wildlife. It's when you know that the photo that's going to make the cover, the photo that you're going to print off, the photo that you want to put on the holiday card, the photo, whatever it is, it's going to be that eye contact. So it may not be this awesome behavior of a humpback whale perfectly breaching, but burst mode is going to really enable you to get as the gorilla's scanning. That a lot of animals do not make a lot of eye contact with you. So it's just a split second, and you're always going to prefer to have three or four photos to choose from of that perfect moment versus barely having one at all. And the same thing goes with just really unique patterns you might see out there. So again, the lesson here is that I no longer take my camera off burst mode. Yes, I have 5 photos of every single landscape photo I've ever taken. When I'm out there, it is a pain to go through, but it's when a magical moment like this happens, it's really hard, even with the shortcut buttons. Like I have all the shortcuts dialed into my camera to have, one button to instantly toggle over to burst mode. Having it set by default has been a huge, huge game changer for me. Okay, so dealing with another kind of movement, we're talking about kind of shutter speed stuff here. Obviously, most of the time with wildlife, we're trying to freeze motion. Like this is a cool shot. I mean, this is really interesting. It's an African wild dog or an African painted wolf in Botswana, and it's like that moment as this thing was on the chase, chasing after the impala, that it just happened to catch it with the legs nicely extended, and that's great. And we know, you can shoot at 1/1600, 1/2000, and snap this. But I do recommend, especially when you have the time. Like you're seeing things for the second time or third time on a trip. You're seeing familiar critters in your own backyard. It might be a butterfly. Think about slowing it down. And I have that little night icon up there. Just, sometimes with point and shoots out there, it's harder to get these settings with the bigger, fancier cameras. Obviously, we're going to be on a shutter speed priority, but a night mode will kind of do this as well. And, even though this previous shot is really quite interesting and, somewhat rare to see, I actually like this photo a lot more. And this is just a happy little accident. I was just experimenting, and it's hard to nail the exact shutter speed to get at the right time, because if you've ever done moving water photography, it's all about the rate of flow. In wildlife photography, it's all about the rate of the animal. How fast is it moving? Is it walking? Is it sauntering? Is it a full-on sprint? But I found something between 1/10 and 1/40th of a second can be really quite amazing. And you'd be surprised how many things this applies to. It's not just the biggest, craziest stuff. It's deer walking through a meadow, it's urban wildlife, it's birds taking off of a branch. I think in this world we're getting inundated with so many photos and so many videos through social media and other things. What if we try to bridge the gap and do something creative? It's kind of like a photo that has a video type feel. And I think it's a fun, creative way to, again, maybe not the first shot when you see wild dogs for your first time, or their first shot when you see something cool in your own backyard, but definitely worth trying. And same thing here, we're photographing the bears of Brooks Falls, classic wildlife encounter. Everybody wants this shot, and it's easier than you think. They do this all day, every day. The timing can be a little bit difficult, but it's very, very possible. So obviously, super fast shutter speed, burst mode. But sometimes, even though this is the shot everybody thinks they want, this is the shot that usually people walk away from trips like mine saying, that was probably the shot of the trip for me. It's my personal favorite. And getting that
Mm.
slow shutter speed of wildlife, this is obviously different than the wild dog because the animal is still and stationary. It's the water that's moving. But again, tuning your eyes, tuning your mind to think about those opportunities, what's moving in the environment is a great example is going back to that wild dog. When I was taking that blurry photo, the camera was moving too. So we had some nice intentional motion blur, intentional camera blur there too. So it's just recognizing these things. Sometimes I go into these trips with a shot list and just force myself for a certain day. Like, I'm definitely going to get 5 motion blur shots today, no matter what. And just making sure you try them, and practice makes perfect. Speaking of perfection, we'll just talk about autofocus for a quick second. To each his own, largely, and I know that you all are quite experienced photographers, so you may have your favorite technique. But I just wanted to give a quick, what my technique is personally is I go for center point autofocus pretty much all the time. So I don't worry about all those other settings. Sometimes when I'm handing my camera off to someone to take a photo of me, like I showed in some of those traveler photos, I'll put it on the zone autofocus just so they have one less thing to have to think about. But no, I found, no matter how much the tracking autofocus gets better and better. I will talk about that in a second because I do use that and it can be quite valuable. But no matter how good the tracking autofocus gets in these cameras, and it's getting really, really good, I do find that my default is a single point autofocus, just set where shutter halfway down, lock focus, recompose, and always focus on the eyes. I'm sure you guys know that, but that is like absolutely paramount in wildlife photography. You can also get the nose in focus. You can also get the fingers in focus and the lips in focus. But if you get those things in focus and not the eyes in focus, the shot is not going to work out. There are very, very, very few shots I've taken in my career where I've intentionally done that and it kind of works. But yeah, focusing on the eyes is absolutely critical. So yeah, the tracking focus is getting good. It's pretty darn amazing. With birds in flight, it's an absolute game changer. We have a little lilac-breasted roller here. This is taken in Zimbabwe, I believe. Yes, Zimbabwe. And it's pretty incredible. So yeah, I do have my camera programmed where I can hit the back button focus and it instantly turns on what Canon calls servo, which Nikon and everybody else, logical, just calls continuous. It's my one qualm with Canon, weird terminology, but nevertheless, we know the lexicon over the years. And so this back button instantly turns on, live view, eye tracking, and continuous focus. And it's a huge, huge thing. If you're not familiar with setting up your camera for wildlife photography, especially I mean, mainly the new mirrorless ones, I got a quick plug for YouTube. Like there are some incredible videos if you just Google search or YouTube search, setting up my R6 Mark II for wildlife, setting up my, Nikon Z8 for wildlife, setting up my Sony A7R for wildlife. There are these like roughly 20-minute videos where these folks walk you through the steps of how to program the different buttons that you probably don't use because a lot of them are it's like it's the light on top of your LCD screen. Most cameras you can program that to do something cool. I can program it to turn on my my high drive motor. There's a little button that's down like near most lenses. It's like your pinky kind of reaches around, and it's supposed to like provide real-time depth of field. I don't ever use that. So now it changes something else on my camera. It allows me to toggle white balance or, something like that. So yeah, that's a quick pro tip is that those videos have been game changers. I oftentimes rent a second body when I go into the field. And so it's oftentimes a body I'm not familiar with and I have to reset it up every time. And boom, the first thing I do is spend 20 minutes. I just go through the steps. Everybody, you find your favorite person, your trusted source. There are many out there, but it's a pretty big game changer for wildlife because having some shortcut buttons can make a world of difference when toggling autofocus for the right time. And so the final thing I'm going to talk about here is just a good classic type of photo is photographing wildlife at sunrise and sunset. I'm going to start off with a landscape photo just as an example. So, here we're over in Bryce Canyon National Park at sun. Is this? I think this is sunset. Yeah, this is sunset. Yeah, of course it is. The whole thing faces west. So yeah, this is sunset. Um, and so oftentimes with sunset photography, what I'm doing is I'm just coupling focus and exposure at the same time. I should say I shoot on full manual with auto ISO. So I still am letting the camera basically choose exposure for me. And so I'll do focus exposure at the same time, meter and focus in the clouds, and it usually turns out, decently well. But what happens when, there's another element in the scene that really demands focus. And this is where this little exposure lock button comes in. On Canon, it's a little asterisk. On Nikon, I think Sony, it's just called AEL or auto exposure lock. And basically, what it does is you can decouple the exposure and focus. So, like you normally do both by hitting and pushing the shutter halfway. This way, you hit that asterisk when your center point autofocus is on the cloud. It stores that focus, or sorry, it stores the exposure for about 10 seconds. You can customize it and say set it for 15 seconds or whatever, but I think by default it's for 10 seconds. And that gives you 10 seconds to recompose your shot or refocus your shot on something else. So I needed those hoodoos in focus. I needed the rocks in focus, but I wanted a nail exposure for the highlights and nail exposure for the clouds. And so decoupling that is really, really quite important. Um, Let me just move past good old rule of thirds thing. I can't do a photo presentation without talking about the rule of thirds at least once or twice. So with wildlife photography, it's the same thing. So we have here zebra with a great sunset. If I were to focus and expose on the zebra, you would have a problem because the highlights would be completely blown out. The zebra would be in great focus, but it wouldn't have the right exposure. I mean, you would have basically too bright of zebra. So here what we're doing, using that asterisk, exposing on the trees and the sunset, dimming down those highlights, bringing the color down, really saturating the sky, and then again, recomposing, using focus on the zebra, recomposing once again, once the shutter's halfway down to recompose the shot, aligning somehow to the rule of thirds, if that's your jam. And then that's how you get the sunrise, sunset, wildlife shots is decoupling that exposure with auto exposure lock. So with that, I think one of the many good ways to learn and be inspired by photography is to not just join and participate in a photo club. That's a great step. Commend you for that. but is to truly like look at a lot of other photographs and look at a lot of other photographers. And you guys have that ability in your club. Just wanted to turn you on to my company, Natural Habitat Adventures, Instagram. It's a love-hate relationship that I have with it, but I do use it a lot, and I think it's a really great tool if you follow the right people and get some really cool exposure to some inspiring photographers. So just wanted to put that out there. I'd be delighted to connect with you on there. In fact, that's a great way to message me if you have any follow-up questions. And then, as I mentioned, I have my own photography podcast. I've been running for about 5 years called The Wild Photographer. It's on all podcast platforms. That QR code is a link to the website that allows you to easily click to all the different platforms. You could download it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a combination of me doing solo episodes, teaching techniques, much like I've done today. And then about every second or third episode is interviewing another kind of photographer, colleague of mine, get some really interesting names out there, fellow photo guides, big names, etc. And then the very last thing is I write a photo tutorial blog for my company, Natural Habitat Adventures. And this is a nice written resource. And it's got, at this point, I've been doing it for about 10 years and I publish weekly. So I don't know, probably 500 articles at least. And so this is another great resource where you can get some great examples. And while podcast is wonderful for downloading and listening, on a car ride or on a plane while you're headed to your next photo destination, I realize that visuals are often quite nice. And so the visuals are, of course, baked into those articles too. And so with that, I will conclude and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great. Questions?
Another question.
Yes.
On traveling to other countries, what is there any particular things you should bring or do before your trip?
Did you hear that?
I did, yeah. I mean, maybe be like more specific, like, like prepping camera gear or like immunizations or.
Yeah, all that stuff, because I hear you go to Africa, you could get
Mm.
diseases and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I've got them all, so I'm completely immune. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, it's really not. It's not anywhere near as crazy as you'd think. There's like one required vaccination for yellow fever. You get it once, and you have it for life. You're immunized for life. It's something you could walk into a travel clinic and probably same day walk out with no appointment and get it. Sometimes they need an appointment, but that's pretty easy. And then, honestly, as long as you're up to date on like all your other like routine vaccinations, tetanus and all that, there's nothing else really required. I could go into like a long detailed thing. Like if you go to a travel clinic and say, I'm going to Botswana, they're gonna instantly think, oh, you're going in the Peace Corps for 3 years living in a hut in Botswana. And that's not what I'm doing. That's not what our travel company is doing. We're staying in places that, have food that, is better than most restaurants. So it's yeah, it's quite different for that. From a camera gear side, um, you know, I I can talk a little bit about like, packing and prepping for all that, but I do as much as I can ahead of time to clear memory cards and bring backup hard drives and bring extra memory and fully charged batteries and I set my time zone in my camera and all those nerdy little things because it's really quite important when you deal with file management because, shooting as much as I do, you're downloading throughout the trip and you need to have really good file management to be able to process all those and also keep your sanity. So yeah, it's sort of all those things, but I could probably go in a lot of different directions of packing and prepping. So I'm happy to go in those, but let me know if that was sort of the gist of it.
One other question was, does he use a neutral density filter, where you can make things slower, like slower shutter speeds and stuff? Was it a 5 or
Yeah, I
6?
do. Yeah, so I have a kit that I really like. It's called the M2 by Freewell. Freewell is just Freewell, and it's magnetic, and so it's great. What you do is you screw on this little magnetic coupler, and then every filter you just unmagnetize and clip. So there's no screwing on. You can take off all the filters. There's no stacking filters. Like one of the big problems I didn't used to use a lot of polarizing filters because I just thought it was so annoying to have to unscrew my UV and then put on the polarizer because as soon as you start stacking them, you get a lot of vignetting. But this new magnetized one is incredible. And there's a kit. It's not crazy expensive. I think it's about $100. It's pretty good quality glass. It comes with a UV, a circular polarizer, and three different ND filters, like a 4, an 8, and a 16 or something like that. And that covers me for just about any sort of slow water that I need. When I need to, as long as if you're photographing water under trees, you can get away with not using an ND filter. But if it's in like bright sunlight, yeah, you have to have something to dim it down. But I love that Freewell system. There's some great ones from a company called Polar Pro and they're variable ND filters, and those are great. They're a little more tuned to videography when you really need quick, precise adjustment. I think for photography, getting if you had one ND to get, it's probably like an ND4 and ND6, something like that. It's 6 stops of light, and that's pretty rock solid.
Anything else?
I have a question.
Yes.
Um, I'm going to Costa Rica, leaving Christmas. And the longest lens I have is I shoot Nikon 100, 400. I've been watching a whole bunch of videos on shooting down there. And everyone says that you need a longer lens. I have a 1.4 teleconverter. So that'll give me a little more reach. I'm debating whether I should rent a lens. But the problem with the lenses that I can afford to rent that aren't like, $600 for a week are the ones that, uh, are, like 5.6 is the minimum, but it's usually 8. So I've heard it's very dark in the rainforest.
Yeah,
Um,
no, that's a great question. Yeah, I'm happy to comment on that. So yeah, it's tricky, right? Because you also have to think about packability, handhold ability. You got to think about how much light it lets in, the quality of the lens, etc. Like I think a 100 400 is no slouch. Like I think that gets you a lot of reach. When you start comparing, like there's some great websites where you can just type in, compare 400 millimeter to 500 to 600 millimeter. And when you see like the original photo and like there's like little red boxes cropped in of like what a 100 is, a 200 to 300 to 400, like it gets significantly less dramatic as you get over like 300 millimeters. So like a 300 to 4 is not a huge difference. Like we look at it literally as like 100 200, like these are even steps, but like there's not a massive difference between 400 and 500. Like what we would probably be comfortable cropping in on a computer is probably more than the difference between a 400 and 500 or 500 and 600. Like I will crop in, the margins for sure. And like that's oftentimes what the difference is. Um, the other side of the equation is nobody ever has enough zoom. No, nobody ever has enough telephoto. We always want more telephoto, right? Like as soon as 800 millimeters become commonplace, like we're gonna want 1,000, we're gonna want 1,200. I would not use the teleconverter if it were me. You lose a stop of light and you lose quality. And so the quality, like what you'll probably find is that unless you really need the megapixels because you're printing off big or for whatever reason, you'll probably find if you were to compare 400 millimeters without the extender cropped in to what 400 millimeters with the extender would be, like you're cropping in the 400 to match the 1.4 extender, you'll probably find the quality is pretty similar. So not having to lug it around, not having to lose the stop of light, I think that's huge. Um, I could ask like if you're shooting a crop frame or full frame sensor, but if you're on a crop frame, you're probably like at 600 millimeters plus anyway, but a bigger lens would obviously get you more reach. I know this has been a long-winded answer, but I'll ask one kind of question back to you. Like, is the majority of your photography going to be birds, or are you kind of like just generalist? Anything that comes my way, I'm going to photograph.
Mainly birds and animals. I've got a full frame, I've got a Z9. So it's a
Okay,
full, and it's pretty much anything that moves.
cool.
Uh,
But it's not like a bird photography trip specialty.
no, it's we're gonna go to various places that have butterflies and hummingbirds and sloths and so all different types of animals.
I think you're good. I mean, if you could hit the magic easy button and pick up a 200 to 600, or like one of these bigger lenses, and it would, fit your budget, it would fit the weight requirements, and it would be easy to carry, and the aperture. Like if you could hit the easy button, sure, like 200 more millimeters is great, but 400 is no slouch. Hummingbird feeders and photography around those. I use a 200 millimeter, so you don't need it there. And then one thing that you'll find is like oftentimes when you see sloths and cool stuff, like they might be in a canopy of the forest and
Right.
like it's already far away. And so this is where I think, honestly, turn that into a wildlife and landscape shot and don't, if it is truly is out of reach, don't try to get that full frame, sloths expression looking out. You can count the eyelashes, like turn it into more of like a, like this is what I'm seeing and experiencing, and this is where sloths live. This is what the Cecropia leaves look like, and really focus on like how you position around it. Like, what does the sky look around it? What is my exposure? Because if you wanted to get like canopy dwelling critters in the way that you see in guidebooks and on the BBC, you would need like a 600 f4 and a 2x extender. You need like the big glass. So trading in the 100 to 400 for like, Tamron makes a great 150 to 600 that's pretty budget friendly, and Nikon makes a great couple other lenses. I don't think that they would drastically improve unless you go for like the super big glass, and that's honestly out of reach for a lot of reasons.
Right. Thank you.
Hmm.
On mention that, you ever use a crop sensor at any point?
Do you use a crop set?
Yeah, so I used to, as I was sort of like elevating in my photography, yeah, I was shooting on, this was back in the DSLR days, the 7D. It was great. I mean, it was awesome. And
I like
and I
that.
definitely missed that reach because the 70 to 200 2.8 with a 7D with a crop sensor is like having, a 1 to 300 millimeter
Mhm.
f2.8. That's awesome. And even in my R5, like I can dial in turning it into a crop sensor. But I gotta say, when I compare on the computer, it's just like I can't do it. Like it's just I'm too much of a pixel peeper kind of like I just want like the utmost quality. I don't know if it's the perfectionist that makes the photographer or the photographer that makes or photography that makes a perfectionist, but it's like it's hard to kind of it's hard to go back just because the quality is there. Now, I know a lot of sports photographer buddies that go for crop sensor because like I just need this thing and it's already high enough quality, it's fine. But I think the biggest thing for me, and this may not be for everyone, but is like I am in low light conditions a lot. And so my ISO is huge. Like where it's hugely important to me. I'm trying to shoot low, but like so the ISO just really doesn't compare. That's why I really haven't gone into some of the other systems, full frame DSLR or full frame mirrorless. So yeah, they're great cameras and definitely recommend them. But with Northern Lights photography, with jungle photography, low light safari photography, it is a big leg up. And then, not not incidentally, like the megapixel count is pretty great. And I do believe in high megapixel cameras for my own work because I can shoot with a 7200 2.8 at dusk when I'm just losing light desperately. And I can crop in and still have a 20 megapixel shot, even though I'm cropping in heavily. And the quality of the lens is there, the quality of the shots there. So for those reasons, I don't anymore, but it's not throwing any shade on the crop frame sensors because that extra reach is fantastic. And you can get better aperture ratings because of that.
Good. Anything else? Okay, I think that's it. Thank you. Oh, thank you so much, Court. It was very informative and I'm sure we all learned new stuff.
Cool. All right. Well, pleasure. Yeah, so great to be here. And yeah, looking forward to keeping in touch if you choose to do so. So thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.